Carrie. How are you doing? We are here for week 4 of our read along for One Book July, chapters 21 through 27 of The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper by Roland, which I'm thoroughly enjoying. I'm sitting here trying to pick a spot in the shade. There really isn't one. And moving the camera somewhere else is not doable because of deck construction. So there's too many things happening all at once. Oh my goodness. So it is currently what I saw somebody refer to as the devil's front porch here. And it is true. It's very hot out here. I am not built for this. So let's get into it. We're going to hope I am less scattered, and we're going to really hope I don't kick this tripod because it is like right smack in front of me. We're doing the best we can. So chapters 21 through 27 of The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper. Chapter 21 was about police notebooks, and I know Romany was very excited about this chapter. Police notebooks 1829 to the present. So one of the things I found really interesting about this chapter was that the beginnings of the police notebook were not what I thought or what I had assumed they were. I assumed that the police notebook started as what I've always seen it as, which is, you show up at a crime scene and you take notes and you interview witnesses and you're in the moment writing things down. That's what I thought it was. That is not at all how they started. They started as logs for beat patrol officers to assure that they were doing their job, right? So they would be like, at such and such a time I walked past this landmark or checkpoint, and then at such and such a time I walked past this landmark or checkpoint, and then they would turn them in and get them signed off on at the end of their shift. And then as the investigation became part of police, this is we're talking in Britain mostly, then they became investigative tools, right? And there is a quote on page 283 in the book about how notebooks are not a guarantee of truth because when police corruption cases started, they talk in here about a couple of them. There was a 1990 report on Birmingham's West Midlands Serious Crime Squad because they got investigated because they had an inordinate number of confessions, and it seemed like a lot of them were worded a lot the same. Well, they weren't real confessions. It was officers were fabricating these confessions. And one of the ways that they proved, and there are several examples in the book of corruption and notebooks being tied into solving that, but the way that they used what became the police notebooks one of its multi-uses, right, was that when they read aloud these confessions, they lasted longer than the interview during which they were supposedly given. Obviously they didn't want people to do such things. They didn't want people to misrepresent things in their logbooks. So they were not allowed to have any gaps. You couldn't leave gaps in your writing to go back and fill things in later. Pages had to be numbered, so you couldn't remove any pages. And you were supposed to make your notes without consulting other officers. You're supposed to make your observations first, right? If you show up at some kind of crime scene, you're supposed to make your observations, your interviews, all that, and not consult with anybody else first. You're supposed to do all your notes first, right? So then we get to the quote that was on page 283. And this is how, up until this point, we really have seen notebooks being kind of like purveyors of truth, right? Especially when we talk about double entry bookkeeping and accounting notebooks. And on 283, it says, the notebook, which had been trusted by medieval merchants as a reliably tamper-proof guarantee of truth, had been shown to be anything but. And like I said, there's several examples in here of police corruption cases and different evidence that was used, how things have changed now to a lot of digital services instead to avoid that. So chapter 22 is author's notebooks. This one begins in 1894 and goes to the present. I just kind of have a couple of bullet points about this one. I'm going to flip ahead to our next quote. So Henry James kept a list of character names. I thought this was really interesting. He just would think of character names, and he kept a list of them that he didn't even have a story for. He just came up with the names, right? So he kept this running list of character names that hadn't found a place in a story yet. So he would keep lists of character names, and then he was also a very social guy. So he would also record little snippets of gossip in his notebooks, right? And then he would kind of let all that marinate together until he had a story. And then he could have this outline, right? Kind of taken from little snippets of gossip here and there, kind of conceive of an outline. And then he would populate that outline with names from his list of character names that he had come up with. So I thought that was really interesting. Patricia Highsmith backs this method up by saying one sentence leads to another, and as you continue making notes, then you close the notebook for a few days, and then you have a story. So it's kind of the same basic idea, right? You take this little note here, take this little note there, close the book, let things marinate for a little while, and eventually maybe a story bubbles to the surface, right? On page 289, there is a quote from Joan Didion. See enough and write it down, I tell myself, and then some morning when the world seems drained of wonder, someday when I am only going through the motions of doing what I am supposed to do, which is right, on that bankrupt morning I will simply open my notebook and there it will all be, a forgotten account with accumulated interest, paid passage back to the world out there. So I love that idea of that's one way you can use your notebook as a tool, is you store these things. You don't need to keep them actively, but store them because you can go back to them, right? And revisit certain things, and you don't have to hold all those things in your head, right? Let's see. And they go to, I love this part, a fantastic example of an author thinking on paper, because that is in the title. And that example is Agatha Christie. Adore Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie used up to 12 notebooks at once, and she would just grab whichever notebook was closest to hand when she needed to write something down. So she would have up to 12 notebooks scattered all over the place at any given time, and if she thought of something she had to do or whatever, she would just grab whatever notebook was closest to her and jot it down. She only dated the page maybe once every 100 pages or so, and she never included the year. So people have worked with these notebooks, have researched these notebooks and said, this is a hot mess, right? Like, we're not even sure what year these entries were made for. They kind of sound like the most lived in notebooks ever, and I am here for that. I love that. I love it so much. There's a quote in here on page 291 describing how the notebooks were really difficult to work with just because they were kind of higgledy-piggledy, right? It says, so there's a list of several things about not dating them very often and whatnot, and then it says, on top of all this, the notebooks are also filled with domestic distractions. Her daughter's homework, scores from rounds of bridge, shopping lists, travel plans, things to do, sketches for dust jackets, and notes of phone calls with her publishers. And yet these incoherent notebooks played an integral role in a peerless career of crime writing. How? And then it does go on to explain how. And oh my gosh, they even describe it as higgledy-piggledy. I hadn't even realized that. So then they go into kind of her brainstorming process, which I just found, it's Agatha Christie. I found it thoroughly interesting. Let's see, the wind blew my page. The wind blew my page. There we go. So yeah, I love the idea that her notebooks are that lived in. She's just fully in them. And then the next couple of chapters, my notes are not quite as long. The chapters are a little bit shorter. Chapter 23 is recipe books, 1639 to present. I love that some of the oldest recipe collections we have are from the 13th century, from the Abbasid Caliphate. People have been cooking forever, right? I'm a terrible cook. I don't like cooking, so maybe that's why my notes are sparse for this chapter. The chapter opens with a great story about, it's a good anecdote about family notebooks, and that was what really, for me, this chapter was about. People have kept recipe notes for centuries and centuries and centuries. And a lot of times recipes are a very family-centered thing, right? Recipes get handed down from one generation to the next in families. So, you go back in history, you can find recipe notes. And for a while there, the book also mentions, like, okay, is it a recipe or is it like a remedy for something, right? Because for a long time, those things could very much go hand in hand, or one be confused for the other. There were 14th century recipe notes found in Zibaldone. In the 17th century, there were finally published cookbooks in England. And it all just speaks to, especially the story that they open the chapter with, it really speaks to family. When I first moved out of my parents' house, yay, long time ago, my mom sent with me just a small spiral notebook that she had hand copied all of my favorite things that she made for me. She hand copied the recipes over, and a lot of them were just kind of, we didn't really have written recipes for them. It's just stuff she made my whole childhood, and into my growing up. But she hand copied everything for me into this little spiral notebook that I still have. And then since then, I've done the same. I've handed these recipes down to my kids. Now for them, a lot of times it's more of take a picture of it and send it to me, but almost the same. Chapter 24 is journaling as self-care, 1968 to present. So James Pennebaker was a psychologist that showed that writing about trauma has a positive mental and physical effect. He published, I believe it was a book, not just an article, but I might have that wrong, or a paper, in 1986. And what he called this process is expressive writing. So he did a lot of studies. They go into great detail in the book about the beginning, the study that started it all, and then it goes on to show how effective expressive writing was and how effective it is across all social strata. So it didn't matter if you were a kid, if you were a grown-up, if you what gender, what did matter. It did not matter whatsoever. All the studies have shown, because there have, since his kind of beginning study, there have been several done based off of that study, works across all social strata, and the fewer constraints that they set for the people participating in the study, the more effective the expressive writing is. And I thought that was a really big takeaway from this chapter is, yes, if it helps you, like to me, I look at this as journaling, but that's very much a personal, right? A lot of my journaling is me personally expressive writing, working through things, whether they be like, problems, or whether they be like problems, right? So it works because of what's called the A to D emotion theory. So you have analog emotions that are nonverbal, they're imprecise, maybe they're kind of amorphous, vague, they're emotions, right? And you sit down and with very few restrictions, don't put a ton of restrictions on yourself, turn those analog emotions into digital chunks. And digital chunks are verbal, they're cognitive, they're easy to organize. So you take these amorphous feelings, right? And you sit down on paper and go, okay, I am going to name this thing, right? Don't keep yourself to a time. Don't keep yourself to how much you have to write or shouldn't write or whatever. And just try to pin down, what is this feeling? Because then you turn it into something that can be worked with. You have put it physically, you've taken it from here or here, right? Where it is this amorphous thing, and you've pinned it down. You can then flip it over, twist it, turn it, look at it. You can really wrangle with it once it is physically here and not just floating here, right? To me, it's almost like if you're sick and you don't know what's going on, and you can't get a diagnosis and nobody can figure out what's going on with you, that is very hard to deal with, because you can't point yourself and nobody else can point you in a direction, because this thing doesn't have a name, right? And once this thing has a name and it's been identified, then hopefully it can be dealt with. That's kind of what this A to D emotion theory feels like to me, is taking what is really it's hard to pin down and deal with your emotions or your thoughts or your feelings or things going on in your life, because they're amorphous. If I want to pin something to a cork board, I have to be able to stick a pin through it. Something amorphous in my head is like gaseous. I can't pin down a gas to the cork board, right? Or vapor or whatever. So I'm getting way off on a tangent, sorry. And this part, I found this part really interesting too. This is key. If you just sit down and try to do expressive writing and all you're doing is regurgitating the negative experience, so if something bad happened, something traumatic, something you're working through, whatever the case may be, and if you sit down and just regurgitate that repeatedly, rather than naming the emotions and then dealing with them, in other words, doing that A to D, right? If you skip that and just sit down every day or whatever the case may be and just consistently regurgitate that thing, that's actually not good for you. That has worse effects on you. So you have to actively be working toward naming and dealing with the thing and not continually just regurgitating it, because a lot of what the big deal about James Pennebaker's study was that it showed that people who are carrying around all the trauma, which we've all been through stuff, everybody has stuff, right? That people who did this sort of expressive writing saw all sorts of benefits, both physically and mentally. And your health getting better, right, isn't going to happen if you just sit down and constantly repeat the bad thing that happened instead of doing that A to D, take the analog, the vaporous, and make it into something physical, pin downable. So I got way on a tangent there, sorry. Chapter 25, I really enjoyed chapter 25. It was really interesting. It's called Electioneering, 1977 to 2003. And this is about Bob Graham. In 1977, Bob Graham was running for governor of Florida. He got this idea. When he got this idea, he was sitting at 1% in the polls. So he's like, you know what? Let's just send it, right? Let's go for it. So he decided, instead of doing the typical politicians, oh, I'm going to go to that factory and I'm going to be there for an hour, the press junket, the press is going to follow me and take pictures with me and I'll be there for half an hour, whatever, and then I'm going to leave. He said, no, I'm going to work 100 different jobs in 100 days because they were nearing 100 days left until the election. And he always had these notebooks with him. He was kind of an obsessive note taker. And he had a rotation of colors he had a particular notebook that he liked, and when he found out they weren't going to be manufactured anymore, he bought out the stock of them. But he would rotate the color of the cover. So he was always afraid of running out. So he would have like the red notebook with him, and then the yellow notebook would be the next one. So he'd carry that one with him too. So when he got toward the end of the red one, he already had the yellow one ready. And that was how he kept them in order, was he rotated, like, I think it was red, yellow, blue, green. He would rotate the colors. So he knew which notebook he was actively working in. And it goes into this whole story that came quite a bit later, like after 9/11, about how he was a very, very kind of, people have called it obsessive note taker. And he had cartons and cartons and cartons stored of these notebooks. Far later in his career, he actually wanted to run for president, and that didn't go very far. And people actually used the whole note taking thing to kind of mock him and imply that maybe he had OCD, maybe he, all sorts of things. Like, people just ran with it. But it did happen. I want to say it was mid to late, early in the 2000s, that several people were accused of knowing that certain investigative techniques were taking place that people had a problem with. I'm not going to go into detail about that here, but I don't want to. It's violent. It made me kind of feel ooky when I read it, but it should be in the story because notebooks played a big part in it. So certain very invasive investigative techniques, and a whole bunch of people said, hey, these people knew this was going on. And thankfully, Bob had all of his notebooks tucked away in cartons, so he had a bunch of librarians start to go through the cartons, and it proved that all these meetings that he had been accused of being at, saying, hey, he knew this was going on, he wasn't even there. So notebooks to the rescue once again. Chapter 26 is Climate Logs, 1850s to the present, and this kind of takes us back to our ship's logs again. So Michael Purvis was a meteorologist in the Yukon, and he started helping with the Old Weather Project. And what the Old Weather Project does is they utilize ship logs to build a database of weather events, to then put all of that information, compile it, and put it into climate models. So obviously weather information for ages now has been recorded automatically, right? It's just recorded automatically. However, if I understood what I read correctly, that is all land-based, right? So as ship's logs became more and more detailed, and they became more rigid in the process of when you took certain readings, how often you took certain readings, what readings they were taking, that information is taken on water, right? So they started going through all these old ship logs and collating all that data. They have a lot of volunteers that do this. It's really interesting. They also have, because ship's logs all vary in their format, right? I think they said they had like 27 different spreadsheet formats, that basically the spreadsheet kind of sits on top of the digitized ship's log. so that volunteers can input the numbers that are in each cell, and it perfectly fits the format, so it decreases human error in transferring that information from the digitized handwritten ship's log to an actual spreadsheet. I thought that was really interesting. And one of the big things they talked about in here is the melting of Arctic ice. And they used a lot of ship's logs to see how much Arctic ice there was hundreds and hundreds of years ago versus what there is now. And they were able to put that into climate models and show how much Arctic ice is melted due to global heating. So I love that the ship log came back again. I didn't know much about ship's logs, and we've read a lot about them in this book, and I've really enjoyed it. So that was chapter 26, and our last chapter of this week. I don't know why it didn't even pop in my head that this would be in here, but I was so tickled. Chapter 27's bullet journals. It's Ryder Carroll. I don't know why I didn't sit and think, okay, what kind of notebooks are going to be in this book? I was just excited to read the book. So we get to chapter 27 and it's bullet journals. I was so excited. I wrote Ryder Carroll, exclamation point. So Ryder Carroll tells this story in the bullet journal method. I don't want to spoil it for either this book or the bullet journal method, so I won't. But he was diagnosed with ADHD. He really had a hard time in school paying attention. And the thing was, is he was very cognizant of it. He started pretty early trying to figure out a way to deal with it. And taking notes in class was a real challenge for him. And he liked to doodle a lot too, right? So he realized over time that taking notes in a list format and kind of distilling down what the teachers were saying into the kind of the shortest bulleted list format possible really kept him focused better. So not only was he able to have notes that made sense to him because he was able to pay attention, but part of that being able to pay attention a little bit better and focus a little more was he was actively taking what was coming out of the teacher and trying to morph it into a distilled version of what the teacher would say so that it would fit nicely into a bulleted list format. So he's actively working with the information he's being given as he's receiving it, and he's physically putting it on paper, which is brilliant. I don't know if you could work with your brain better than that. Roland Allen makes the comment in here that Ryder Carroll really unlocked the power of her notebook, which was externalizing thoughts, right? So much of what you can do in a notebook as an active tool is externalizing your thoughts. And just think about what we just talked about with expressive writing, how beneficial it is to externalize those thoughts. They're not vaporous. They live somewhere now, right? And there's one quote in here that I'd like to read from Ryder Carroll. He says that, talking about things coming and going through his mind constantly, he says, in my mind, things just come and go constantly, and that doesn't allow me to make progress. It's one thing to have a notion, it's another to really develop it. I make significantly more progress in my thinking when I have tools to process my thoughts and get them to another place. So note making is an opportunity to interact with my thoughts that I wouldn't naturally have, because as he said, his thoughts come and go, come and go, come and go, come and go. So having an active tool to pin those thoughts down, right, gives you a place to also develop them. They just don't, finally kick the tripod. They don't just pew, pew, in and out, right? So that is it for week 4. That was chapters 21 through 27 of The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper by Roland Allen. It is blazes hot out here. So we are down to our last week. We have, what do we have left? Monday, 28, 29, 30, 31. We have 4 chapters left. Yeah, I'm having even a hard time counting to 4. It's too hot. We're getting down to the end. I hope you all have been enjoying this. I am thoroughly enjoying our conversations in between doctor's visits. I am getting back and forth to comments as much as I can. So I really appreciate everybody who's been participating. I'm hearing a lot of you are enjoying this a whole lot. I love hearing from the accountants who are enjoying this, especially. And I've heard from people who are like, oh, I know nothing about accounting, but I see we keep coming back to that double entry bookkeeping idea and how I didn't realize what a big role it played in notebooks proliferating history, right? And that was my thing about it too. So it's funny to hear it like from both sides. I hope you are enjoying this. I will be back hopefully Thursday or Friday this week with our last video. Don't hold me to that. Don't hold me to that. I might get a little behind, but we will wrap up. And then I think we will also be, I'm gonna see if I can make it work with the whole filming setup. I thought it would be fun to do, we'll do like a July flip and then switching what I'm switching, which is the format will still be the same. I'm gonna change my cover, I think, for August. So I don't know, maybe that'll be a fun video to record. So I hope you're doing well. Again, hope I didn't talk too fast. I have a very bad habit of doing that. I'm going to go in the air conditioning. I will see you all soon. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.